Good morning. Welcome to daily chapter reading of the Septer's Return by Dan Chernenko, Chapter 2. King Gruz swung up into the saddle. General Hirundo, who was already mounted, grinned slightly. "You're getting pretty good at that, Your Majesty," he said. "Oh, shut up," Gruz answered, and Hirundo laughed out loud. The trouble was, the general was right, and Gruz knew it. Over the years, he had become a pretty decent horseman. He'd never intended to. On a river galley, even on one of the tall-masted ocean-going ships the Avernans were building in imitation of the Chernigor pirates, he knew what he was doing. He'd never planned on riding very much. He'd never planned on becoming king of Avernus neither. That had worked out pretty well, at least so far. As for horsemanship, when he shrugged, his gilded mail shirt clinked on his shoulders. Instead of a stallion, he rode a good-natured gelding. He'd done that even when he knew he was going to get in a fight. He valued control and obedience more than fire and a horse. "Are we ready?" he asked. "If we weren't, would we be doing all this?" Hirundo said reasonably. "Let's go then." Gruz used the reins and the pressure of his knees to urge his horse into motion. Hirundo's high-spirited charger pranced along beside it. As they rode out of the stables, mounted imperial lancers formed up around them. The gentlemen wore heavy shirts of mail and rode big, strong horses. Even the horses wore armor that protected their heads and breasts. The lancers' charge was irresistible at close range. The problem was getting the Mentishi, who usually kept but loose order on their ponies, to bunch together long enough to receive a charge. "Your Majesty," the guardsmen shouted. Gruz waved to them. Under the bar nasals of their conical helmets, a good many of the troopers grinned at him. He waved again. "Are we going to run the nomads ragged?" he called. "Yes," the lancers shouted. Gruz waved again. "I hope we are anyway," he thought. The rest of the army he would take south from the city of Avernus waited outside the walls. Before he could go out to it, though, he needed to take care of one loose end. "Where are Tericles and Otus?" he asked. "They were in there getting saddled up too," Hirundo said. "What's taking them so long?" "Well, if you think I'm a poor excuse for a cavalryman," Gruz said. Hirundo threw back his head and laughed. "Ha ha ha." A minute or two later, Terocles and Otus emerged. Both of them rode mules. Gruz had hardly ever known a wizard who trusted himself on horseback, while the freed thrall, Gruz hoped he was a freed thrall, hadn't had much chance to acquire the equestrian art. Tericles dipped his head to Gruz. "Your Majesty," he murmured. "Your Majesty," Otus echoed. He was a brown-haired, open-faced man approaching his middle years. He looked like anybody else, in other words. He sounded like anybody else, too. Oh, he had an accent that said he came from the south, but a lot of Avernans had that kind of accent. He also had a slightly old-fashioned turn of phrase. When thralls spoke at all, they spoke as ordinary Avernans had centuries before. They'd long been cut off from the vital changing current of the language. When he was a thrall, Otus might have had as many words as a 2-year-old. He might not, too. He'd had to learn to speak as a child would after being freed from the charm that had held him down for so long. He learned far faster than a child would have, though. Only tiny traces of how he'd once talked lingered in his speech. "Are you ready to head down to your homeland?" Gruz asked him. "Yes, Your Majesty," he answered. "I would like to see my woman freed. I would like to see all thralls freed." "So would I," Gruz said. "That's one of the things we're going to try to do. I hope we can." He glanced toward Tericles. If they couldn't do that, and if they couldn't protect themselves from being made into thralls after they crossed the Stura, they would do better not to go over the river at all. But Tericles' magic had said that they would cross it. Not that they should, but that if they would. If Gruz was going to make the attempt, he wanted to make it on his terms. Tericles nodded back. He had to know what was in Gruz's mind. He seemed confident his sorcery could handle what was required. Gruz didn't care whether he was confident. The king cared about whether he was right. We'll find out, Gruz thought. Let's get moving, he said harshly. Flanked by the lancers, he rode towards the capital's southern gate. The streets that led from the palace to the gates were cobbled. Most of the ones that ran into them weren't. A few people came out to watch the king and his retinue go by. Men wore tunics and baggy trousers. Women had on either short tunics and skirts that reached their ankles or long tunics that fell just as far. In past years, Gruz had drawn bigger crowds when he went out on campaign. He'd done it every year lately, though, and it didn't impress the jaded city dwellers anymore. "Beat the lousy Chernogors," somebody called, and waved a broad-brimmed felt hat. Gruz waved back without batting an eye. He had beaten the Chernogors the year before. Some people knew that. Others, like this fellow, hadn't gotten the word. These days, Gruz took in stride things that would have infuriated him when he was younger. The shout infuriated Otis. "Don't they know what's going on, Your Majesty?" he demanded. "How can they not know? They're free. They don't have the banished one clouding their minds. Why shouldn't they know?" "They have their lives to lead," Gruz answered with a shrug. "They don't care who the enemy is. As long as it's someone far away, that suits them fine. That's all most people want from a king, you know, to make sure enemies stay far away. Nothing else matters nearly as much." "Except taxes," Hirundo and Terocles said the same thing at the same time. But Gruz shook his head. "They'll even put up with taxes as long as things stay peaceful. If they get a fight on their doorstep, that's when they start thinking the king is squandering what they give him." Out through the open gates they rode. The great valves had swung inward. The sun gleamed off the iron that sheathed the heavy timbers. No foreign enemy had ever stormed the city of Avernus. Back when Gruz first took the throne, King Dagobert of Thervingia had besieged the Avernan capital. He'd had no better luck than any other invader. These days, King Berto, Dagobert's son, ruled the Thervings. Unlike Dagobert, he cared more for prayer than plunder. Gruz hoped he had long reign and that he stayed pious. With trouble in the north and south, Avernus needed peace in the east. Horsemen and foot soldiers were drawn up in neat ranks on the meadow outside the city. Most of the horsemen were archers. Some foot soldiers also carried bows. Others shouldered long pikes to hold enemy soldiers away from the bowmen. "Gruz," the army shouted at one man. "Hurrah for King Gruz! 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 Avernus!" The cry came echoing back from the brown stone walls of the city. Hirundo smiled sidewise at Gruz. "You hate hearing that, don't you?" "Who, me?" Gruz answered, deadpan. Hirundo chuckled. The king raised his voice so the soldiers could hear him. "We are going south of the Stura. The Mentashe have had it all their own way down there for too long. Time to show them that land is ours by right. We've beaten them on this side of the river, and we're going to beat them on that one." "Hurrah for King Gruz!" the soldiers shouted again. Gruz pointed south. "We are going to go forward until we win or until I give the order to retreat. I do not intend to give the order to retreat." The soldiers cheered again. Guardsmen around him, his general and his wizard and the freed thrall with him, Gruz started down toward the Sura. A dog pranced on its hind legs on a wooden ball. A cat leaped through a hoop. A rooster ran up a ladder and rang a bell at the top. Another dog turned flips on the back of a pony that trotted round and round in circles. Krex and Pitta clapped their hands. Lanius and Saucia exchanged amused glances. They had to admire the animal trainer's skills, but neither one of them was quite as enchanted as their children. "How does he make them do these things?" Pitta whispered to Lanius. "He gives them food like they like when they do something he likes," Lanius answered. "Before long, they get the idea." Pitta shook her head. "It can't be that easy." And so it wasn't, not in detail. She was bound to be right about that. But Lanius knew he had the broad outlines right. He'd trained Pouncer to come up and sit on his chest that way. It wasn't much of a trick, nothing to compare to what these animals were doing, but the principle couldn't be much different. When the show ended, the pony lowered its head and extended its right forefoot in a salute. The dogs did the same. The rooster spread its wings while stretching out its leg. The cat yawned, and the trainer, a big-nosed, bushy-mustached man named Colorio put both hands in front of his chest and bowed very low. "Well done," Lanius called. His why and children echoed him. Colorio bowed again, not quite so deeply. "I thank you, your majesties, your highnesses. Always a pleasure to work for such an appreciative audience." He had a showman's voice, a little louder and a little more clearly enunciated than it needed to be. Lanius had also paid him well to perform, but he was much too smooth to bring up such a tiny detail. He spoke to his assistant, a youth who, except for lacking a mustache, looked a lot like him. The youngster took charge of the animals and led them out of the audience chamber where they'd put on their show. Colorio started to follow. Lanius said, "Wait a moment, if you please." The animal trainer stopped and turned back. "Of course, your majesty, I am at your service." Though he sounded more than a little surprised and curious, the bow he gave the king now was as smooth as any of the others. Lanius got to his feet. "Walk with me," he said, and Colorio fell in beside him. When a pair of royal guards started to approach, Lanius waved them back out of earshot. They looked at each other but obeyed. People mostly did obey Lanius, as long as Gruz was away from the palace. "Like I say, your majesty, I'm at your service. But what sort of service can I do for you?" Yes, Colorio was curious. He also sounded nervous. Lanius didn't suppose he could blame him for that. "First things first," the king said. "Can you keep secrets? Give me the truth, please. If you say no, I won't be angry. I'll just talk to someone else. But if you say yes and then let your mouth run free, I promise you'll wish you were never born." "I don't blab, your majesty," Colorio said, "and I'm not the sort who gets soused in a wine shop and spills his guts without even knowing he's doing it either." Did he mean it? Lanius decided he did. "All right then. Have you ever tried to train a mon-cat? Would you like to?" "I never have," Colorio said slowly. "There aren't many outside the palace." He was right about that. All the mon-cats in Avernus were descended from the pair of a Chernigor ambassador had given to Lanius some years earlier. The king had made presents of a few of them to favored nobles, but only a few. Most he kept himself. Colorio went on. "I would like to, yes, if I get the chance. If you want it, I think it's yours," Lanius said. "There's one particular mon-cat I'd like you to try to teach one particular thing." Colorio bowed one more time. "I am your servant, your majesty. What is it that you want the animal to learn?" But after Lanius described it, the trainer frowned, meaning no disrespect, but that is not one thing. It is a whole series of things. The mon-cat would have to learn them one at a time and would also have to learn to do them in the right order. I am not sure whether the creature would be clever enough. I am not sure whether it would be patient enough either. Did he mean he wasn't sure whether he would be patient enough? Lanius wouldn't have been surprised. The king said, "I want you to do the best you can. If you fail, I will not punish you, though I may try again with someone else. If you succeed, you and yours will never want for anything. I promise you that." Colorio licked his lips. He was interested. Lanius could see that. But the animal trainer said, "Again, your majesty, I mean no disrespect to you, but would King Gruz also make me the same promise?" Even someone as far down the social scale as he was knew that Gruz was the one with real power in the palace. "I'm not offended," Lanius said, which was mostly true. Though it wasn't completely true, it needed saying. Colorio looked relieved to hear it. The king continued, "Here, though, I think I can tell you that he would. This is also something in which he is interested. I will write to him and ask if you like." "No, your majesty, no need for that. I believe you," Colorio said quickly. He'd taken his doubts as far as he could, probably further than most men would have dared. "What you just told me is plenty good enough." "Then I think we have a bargain." Lanius held out his hand. Colorio clasped it. The trainer's fingers, his palm, and the back of his hand bore an amazing number and variety of scars. Not all the animals he dealt with had been docile. Eagerness surging through him, Lanius asked, "Do you want to start now?" "Might I ask to wait until tomorrow?" Colorio replied. "I would like to tend to my own beasts, if you don't mind." Lanius realized he'd been too impetuous. He nodded. Of course. Oh, one other thing. The animal trainer raised a curious eyebrow. Lanius said, "For the kingdom's sake, and also for your own safety, don't talk about what you're doing here, not to anyone, not ever. This is the secret I asked you if you could keep." Not talk about training a mon cat for my safety? Colorio sounded as though he couldn't believe his ears. "I am not joking," Lanius said. The trainer's smile and the way he shook his head said he didn't understand, but wasn't about to argue. "I'll keep quiet," he said. "My tongue's not a babbling brook. I told you so, and I meant it." "Good," Lanius nodded again. "That's part of the bargain we just made. For a chance to train mon cats, I'd keep my mouth shut about all kinds of things," Colorio said. Lanius liked that. Colorio didn't say anything about the chance to work with the king and under the king's eye. Lanius would have been amazed if that weren't in the animal trainer's mind, but he had the sense not to say it. Maybe training mon cats really was more important to him. Lanius could hope so anyway. Impulsively, he stuck out his hand again. Colorio shook it. Lanius said, "I think we're going to get along just fine." Some of the 9 rivers were bridged. Ferries and barges took the Avernan army across the rest. River galleys, long and lean and deadly, patrolled upstream and down at each crossing. With their oars moving in smooth unison, they reminded Gruz of so many centipedes striding across the water. They also made him long for the days when captaining one of them was as far as his ambitions ran. When he said as much to Hirundo, his general laughed at him. "You're only saying that because you've got a sore backside." "I don't have a sore backside," Gruz answered. "I've done enough riding by now that I'm hardened to it. But those were simpler days. I didn't have so many things to worry about. I was down at the Stura most of the time, but I hardly ever thought about the Banished One. The Mentashe? Yes, of course. Their lord? No." He didn't think about you in those days either. "If you find yourself in the Banished One's thoughts, you've come up in the world," Hirundo said. Gruz laughed. He supported it was funny if you looked at it the right way. "Still, I could do without the honor, thanks." "Could you?" Hirundo was usually the one quick to laugh. As he and the king sat their horses just beyond the river bank, watching the army come off the barges, the general seemed altogether serious. "If the Banished One didn't have you in his mind, would he worry about anyone in Avernus?" Lanius, Gruz thought, and Tericles. Like him, they'd received dreams in which the Banished One appeared and spoke. Gruz could have done without that honor too. Never in battle had he known the fear that curdled his innards when he came face to face with the Banished One's calm, cold, inhuman beauty, even in a dream. He knew too well he was opposing something ever so much stronger than he was. He didn't think Hirundo had ever had one of those horrifying dreams, but whatever reason, the Banished One didn't reckon Hirundo dangerous enough to confront that way. The officer wouldn't have spoken so lightly of the foe if he'd met him like that. No one who'd directly faced the Banished One's power spoke lightly of him. Swearing sergeants shepherded soldiers back into their places. The army started south again. Peasants working in the fields took one look at the long column coming down the road and fled. Gruz had seen that many times before. It always saddened him. The farmers and herdsmen didn't think the Avernan soldiers were invaders. They were afraid of being robbed and plundered just the same. Here, though, the soldiers didn't have to forage off to the countryside to keep themselves fed. At Gruz's order, supply dumps awaited the army all the way down to the valley of the Stura. Wheat and barley would give them bread, cattle and sheep meat, and there was ale and wine to drink. The soldiers had plenty, but the peasants didn't know that and weren't inclined to take chances. Low ranges of hills running roughly east and west separated the valleys of the 9 rivers from one another. The roads that ran straight across the valleys wound and twisted as though they went through the hills. They followed the passes that had been there since the gods made the world. Gru's mouth twisted when that thought crossed his mind. The god said to have made the world was Milvago, whose children had cast him out of the heavens and who was now the Banished One. Had he turned to evil before Olor and Kuli and the rest expelled him? or had been ousted and sent down to this lesser sphere infuriated and corrupted him so that he became evil only after coming to earth? Bruce had no idea. Only the banished one and the gods in the heavens knew, and Bruce would have bet they told different stories. In the end, how much difference did it make? The banished one dwelt on earth now and was evil now, and that was all mere mortal needed to know. Riding at the head of the column, Bruce escaped all the dust the horsemen and soldiers kicked up moving along a dirt road. When he looked back over his shoulder, the cloud the army kicked up obscured most of it. Then Bruce looked ahead down into the valley of the Stura. The scars from the fire and sword the Mentishi had inflicted on it were still plain to see. Those scars would have been worse yet if the No-Mans hadn't started fighting among themselves instead of going on with their war against Avernus. They were bad enough as things were, and they told King Gru's everything worth knowing about the Banished One's disposition. I have warned you against your plots and schemes. The voice that resounded inside King Laenius' head reminded him of the tolling of a great bronze bell. The face he saw was supremely handsome, even beautiful, yet somehow all of the more frightful because of that. The Banished One stared at him out of eyes of fathomless as the depths between the stars. I have warned you, and you have chosen not to heed. You will pay for your foolishness. It was a dream. Laenius knew that. He had them before, but the dreams the Banished One sent weren't only dreams, as people said after they woke up from bad ones. The terror they brought felt no less real than it would have in the waking world, and the memory of it lingered, indeed grew worse as the waking world returned. Ordinary bad dreams were nothing like that, for which the king praised the gods in the heavens. I would pay worse, Laenius answered, if I did not do all I could for what I know to be right. As always, the Banished One's laughter flayed like knives. You think so, do you? You are wrong, worm of a man thing. And when the heavens are mine once more, everyone will pay, everyone. He laughed again and seemed to reach for the king. Laenius woke up then with a horrible start that left him sitting up in his bed, his heart pounding like a drum. He breathed a long slow sigh of relief. The one resemblance the dreams the Banished Ones sent held to the usual kind was that nothing harmful could really happen in them, or nothing had yet. When the exiled god's hand stretched out toward the king, though, Sosia stirred sleepily. Are you all right? She asked, yawning. Yes, I'm all right now. Saying it made it feel more true to Laenius. A bad dream, that's all. He eased himself down flat again. Go back to sleep, I'm going to, Sosia said. Within a few minutes she was breathing softly and heavily once more. Laenius took much longer to drop off. He didn't find sleep so welcoming, not with the Banished One lurking there. He'd never talked with his wife about the dreams that Banished One sent. The only people to whom he'd mentioned them were Gruz and Tericles. They were the only ones he thought likely to understand, for the Banished One sent them dreams too. Laenius did finally fall back to sleep. A sunbeam sneaking between the window curtains woke him. When he opened his eyes, normally sleepily, not with the terrified stare he always had after confronting the Banished One, he found Sosia was already up and about. He got out of bed, used the chamber pot, and pulled off his nightshirt and replaced it with the royal robes. Servants would have swarmed in to dress him if he'd wanted them to. He'd never been able to see much point in that. He was the one who could best tell how his clothes hung on his bony frame. Halfway through his breakfast porridge, he snapped his fingers in excitement. Colorio was coming to the palace this morning. Laenius wondered what the animal trainer would make of Pouncer and what the Mon cat would make of Colorio. The king ate faster. He wanted to finish before Colorio got there. He did by a few minutes, which was perfect, but when Colorio came into the palace, he startled Laenius. The animal trainer was far from the confident showman he'd been while presenting his beasts to Laenius and his family the night before. He was pale and subdued, and gulped at the wine a servant brought him. Concerned, Laenius said, "Is something wrong?" The trainer started. "I'm sorry, Your Majesty. I didn't know it showed. It's nothing, really." His tone and his whole attitude belied the words. "Just a bad dream I had after I got home last night." "Did you?" Laenius said. Colorio nodded. The king urged him aside out of earshot of the servants. To be safer still, he lowered his voice to something not far from a whisper before asking, "Did you dream of the banished one?" Calurio's bloodshot eyes widened. By the gods indeed. How could you know that, your majesty?" Instead of answering, the king looked around. No one seemed to be paying any special attention to him and Calurio. All the same, he was obscurely glad, or maybe not so obscurely, that Otis was nowhere near the palace. Still in that near whisper, Lanius said, "How do I know? Because he came to me in the night too, that's how." What did he want of you?" The animal trainer's voice shook. "To warn me, to threaten me, really," Lanius answered. "When you see him, that's what he does. He's come to Gruz too, and to some others." Lanius didn't like calling Gruz the king, or even a king. Sometimes, like it or not, he had to, but not here. He didn't know how far he could trust Calurius either. The trainer didn't need to know the kingdom's chief wizard had seen the banished one face to face in dreams. Calurio shuddered. "I thought he would do worse than threaten. I thought those hands of his would tear out my liver." Lanius patted the other man on the back. "I know what you mean. Believe me, I do. But the one thing I can tell you is that he can't hurt you in these dreams. He never has, not in all the years since I saw him for the first time. If Gruz were here, he would stay the same." "He can frighten you half to death," Calurio said feelingly. "Yes, but only halfway there." Lanius hesitated, then went on. "As a matter of fact, I can tell you one other thing, or I think I can. Seeing the banished one in a dream is a compliment of sorts." By the way, the animal trainer shuddered again. It was a compliment he could have done without. Lanius persisted even so. "It is. It means he takes you seriously. It means you worry him. It means he wants to frighten you out of doing whatever you're doing." "Training a moncat?" Calurio's laugh was raucous. "He might be plumb daft if that worries him. Maybe, but then again, maybe not too." Lanius said. The look Calurio gave him said he might have been plumb daft. "All the same," Lanius continued, "you never can tell. Come on, you can see the beast for yourself." By the trainer's expression, he regretted having anything to do with moncats. Lanius wondered if he'd have to look for somebody else, but Calurio gathered himself. "All right, your majesty, I'm coming. By Olor's beard, I've earned the right, earned it and paid for it." "Let's go then. Shall we stop in the kitchen first for some meat scraps?" Lanius said. The question made Calurio smile for the first time since he'd set foot in the palace. "You know that much, do you? Yes, let's stop there. The way to get any beast to do what you want is to give it a treat when it does. One step at a time, that's how you work in this business." He carried the meat scraps in a little earthenware bowl. Lanius led him through the palace winding corridors to the moncat's chamber. The king hoped Pouncer wouldn't have decided to disappear into the passages between the walls. That would have been annoying, to say the least. To his relief, the moncat he wanted was there with the others. Calurio stared at all of them with a fascination, even after Lanius pointed out the one he'd been working with. "Here, let me have a scrap," Lanius said. "I've taught him one little trick myself." He lay down on the floor and thumped his chest. Sure enough, Pouncer came running over and scrambled up onto him to claim the treat. Calurio made as though to bow. "Not bad, your majesty, not bad at all." Lanius scratched Pouncer behind the ears. The moncat deigned to purr. The king said he's also taught himself a trick or two. When he goes into the kitchen, he likes to steal serving spoons. He likes silver best. He has expensive tastes, but he'll take wooden ones too. Sometimes he'll steal forks, but it's usually spoons. Now Calurio studied Pouncer like a sculptor eyeing a block of marble and wondering what sort of statue lay hidden within. Here was his raw material. How would he shape it? "Well, your majesty," he said, "we'll see what we can do." Riding through the valley of the Stura toward the river that marked the border between Avernus and the lands of the Mentici, Gruz was doubly glad the nomads had fallen into civil war. Too much of the damage they'd done here still remained. Too many peasant villages were only crumbling ruins with no one living in them. Here in the south, people planted when the fall rains came and harvested in the springtime, the opposite of the way things worked up by the capital. But too many fields that should have been fat with wheat and barley had gone back to weeds. Too many meadows were untended scrub, and too few cattle and sheep and horses and donkeys grazed on the ones that remained. When the king remarked on that to Chernenko, the general said, "Now they're doing it to themselves, and it serves them right." "But they're doing it to the thralls too," Gruz said. "If things go the way we hope they will, we're going to have to start thinking of the thralls as Avernans. We can turn them back to Avernans again. We'd better be able to, somehow. If we can't, we are in trouble." Chernenko raised an eyebrow. His laugh sounded startled. "To me, they're just thralls. They've always been just thralls. But that's what this is all about, isn't it?" "That's one of the things this is all about." Gruz always had this Septer of mercy in his mind, and ever more so as he came farther south and so drew closer to it. But as he drew closer to it, he also got the feeling talking about it, showing that he was thinking about it, grew more dangerous. He didn't know if that feeling sprang from his imagination alone. Whether it did or not, he didn't care to take the chance. By King Olor's strong right hand, it'll be good to hit back at the Mentashe on their own soil, Chernenko said. "We've fought here inside Avernus for a cursed long time. All they had to do to get away was make it over the Stura. He never dared go after them, but we owe them a bit, don't we?" "Just a bit," the king said, his voice dry. Chernenko laughed again, this time sarcastically. How many times had the Mentashe raided southern Avernus in the 4 centuries and more since the Septer of Mercy was lost? How much plundering, how much destruction for the sport of it, how many murders, how many rapes were they to blame for? Not even Lanius, clever as he was, could begin to give an accounting of all their atrocities. The farther the army advanced into the broad valley of the last of the 9 rivers, the worse the devastation got. Not only villages had fallen to the Mentashe, so had more than one walled city. The nomads didn't have elaborate siege raids the way the Avernan army did, but if they burned the fields around a city, slaughtered the livestock, and killed the peasants who raised the crops, the townsfolk inside the walls got hungry. Then they had 2 choices. They could starve or open their gates to the Mentashe and hope for the best. Sometimes starving turned out to be the better idea. Otis rode close to King Gruz. The former thrall stared at the countryside with wide eyes, as he had ever since leaving the capital. "This land is so rich," he said. "Here? By the gods, no." Gruz shook his head. "What we saw farther north, that was fine country. This used to be. It will be again once people finish getting over the latest invasion, but it's nothing special now. Even the way it is, it's better than you'll find on the other side of the river." Otis pointed south. "Farmers who care work this land. They do everything they can with it, even when that is not so much. Over there," he pointed again, "you might as well have so many cattle tilling the soil. Nobody does anything but what he has to do. The people, the thralls, don't see half of what they ought to do. If things went wrong on the far side of the Stura, the whole army, or however much of it was left alive after the Mentashe got through with it, would probably be made into thralls. It had happened before. A king of Avernus had lived out his days dead of soul in a little peasant hut somewhere between the Stura and Yozgat. After that, no Avernan army had presumed to cross the last river until now." Was the banished one laughing and rubbing his hands together, looking forward to another easy triumph? Had everything that had happened over the past few years, including the civil strife among the Mentashe, been nothing but a ruse to lure Gruz and the Avernan army down over the Stura? Could the banished one see that far ahead? Could he move the pieces on the board so precisely? Was Tericles' thrall-freeing sorcery all part of the ruse? Gruz shook his head. If the exiled god could do all that, there was no hope of resisting him. But if he could do all that, he would have crushed Avernus centuries earlier. Whatever he'd been in the heavens, he had limits in this material world. He could be opposed. He could be beaten. Otherwise, the Chernogors would bow down to him as the fallen star, the way the Mentashe did. Cruz campaigns in the north had made sure that wouldn't happen. Sunlight glinted off water in the distance. A smudge of smoke near the Stura marked the city of Anna. The king knew the town well from his days as a river galley captain. It hadn't fallen to the nomads even when things seemed blackest for Avernus. Laying on the broad river, it depended less on nearby fields for food than towns farther from the Stura, and archers and catapults on river galleys had taken their toll on the Mentici who ventured too close to the bank. Anna was used to soldiers and sailors. It was always heavily garrisoned. Any king with eyes to see knew the border towns stood as bulwarks against trouble from the south. A great flotilla of river galleys patrolled the Stura now. The river had tributaries that flowed in from the south as well as from the north. They hadn't seen Avernan chips on them for many, many years. Soon they would again. Along with Harundo, Gruz stood on Anna's riverfront wall, peering south into the land where no Avernan soldiers had willingly set foot for so very long. It looked little different now from the country on this side of the Stura. Off in the distance stood a peasant village. It was full of thralls, of course. From this distance it looked the same as an ordinary Avernan village in spite of what Otis said. No matter how it looked, the difference was there for now. With luck, it wouldn't be there much longer.